There is a train. It sits motionless on a track that leads into a city no longer fully alive and no longer fully dead. Fog rolls across the platform in slow, heavy curtains. Gas lamps gutter and hiss. Somewhere in the distance, metal scrapes against stone. A sound that could be wind, or could be something walking on legs it was never supposed to have. You are on that train, and you do not remember why. Your name is P. You are not a man. You are not a monster. You are something in between. A puppet given a human face, dressed in a fine dark suit, carrying a cane that opens into a blade. Someone made you. Someone sent you here. And somewhere in this dying city, in the smoke and the broken clockwork and the blood-slicked cobblestones, is the man who built you, waiting for you to find him. The city is called Krat. It used to be beautiful. Welcome to Nightfall lore. Tonight we are going somewhere different. We are stepping away from the gothic shores of Yharnam, away from the fog, wall and the bonfire, and we are walking into a world that wears a different kind of darkness, one wrapped in fairy tale, in the warm amber glow of gas lamps, in the ticking of clockwork hearts and the slow, mechanical breathing of things that should not breathe at all. Lies of P is a 2023 action developed by NeoWiz and Round 8 Studio. It draws its bones from the classic story of Pinocchio, the wooden puppet who wanted to be a real boy, and rebuilds that story into something far more melancholy, far more violent, and far more philosophically rich than anyone expected. It is a story about lies, about what it costs to tell them, and what it costs not to. About what separates a human being from a very convincing imitation of one. And underneath all of that, it is a story about a father and a son, and the catastrophic weight of what one of them was willing to sacrifice. Tonight, we are going to walk through every layer of that story. We are going to begin at the beginning, with the world before Krat fell, and we are going to follow every thread all the way to the end, through the multiple conclusions the game offers, through the mysteries it leaves open, and through the quiet, devastating implications of what the whole thing means. So find a comfortable position, let the room settle around you, and let Krat come to you slowly, the way fog comes without announcement, without hurry, until you realize it has been there the whole time. To understand what happened to Krat, you have to understand what Krat was built on, and to understand that you have to understand Ergo. Ergo is the foundational substance of the Lies of P universe. It is, in the most literal sense, the stuff of life, a crystallized energy that exists inside all living things, accumulating over time, deepening with experience and emotion and memory. It glows with a blue-gold light when refined, and it sits at the intersection of science and something older and stranger than science. The alchemists of this world, the learned men and women who spent generations studying the properties of Ergo, came to believe that it was not merely a biological byproduct. They believed it was the essential animating force of consciousness itself, the soul, if you were willing to use that word, the ghost in the machine, if you preferred something colder. The city of Krat did not invent Ergo. Ergo had been known and studied for decades, perhaps longer, in various forms across this alternate history version of the late 19th century. But Krat did something that no other city had managed. It turned Ergo into an industrial resource. The Alchemists of Krat, a collective of brilliant, ambitious and not entirely ethical researchers, discovered that ergo could be harvested from living tissue and used to power mechanical constructs. If you could build a puppet, an automaton of sufficient complexity, and seed its framework with refined ergo, something remarkable happened. The puppet moved. Not in the jerky, predictable manner of clockwork. It moved with intention, with responsiveness, with something that looked from a sufficient distance, almost like thought. This discovery changed everything. Krat was already a prosperous city, perched on the edge of an industrial revolution, a place where wealth and technology were beginning to concentrate in the hands of those who understood how to use both. The Alchemists, led in their most ambitious period by a genius named Geppetto, full name Geppetto Lorenzini, though few called him anything but Geppetto, saw in this discovery not merely a scientific curiosity, but a total transformation of the labour economy. If puppets could be built to work, to follow instructions, to perform complex physical tasks without rest or complaint or wages, then the possibilities were, in the most literal sense, limitless. And so, the puppet industry was born. Krat became the world's leading manufacturer of what were eventually called Petrarchan puppets, complex mechanical humanoids powered by ergo, capable of performing an enormous range of tasks. The factories of Krat hummed with production. The city's architecture reflected its ambitions. Grand boulevards, ornate civic buildings, hotels of breathtaking luxury, concert halls and opera houses and shopping galleries that rivaled anything in the great capitals of Europe. Krat grew wealthy. Krat grew proud. The puppets were everywhere. They cleaned the streets and staffed the hotels and worked the factories and carried packages through the alleys and played instruments in the restaurants and tended the gardens of the great houses on the hill. They were a constant silent presence, polite, efficient, tireless. Most were designed to appear roughly humanoid, though their faces were deliberately artificial, smooth, mask-like, beautiful in an unsettling way. The city's wealthy did not want to forget that their servants were not people. It was considered a matter of social hygiene. The majority of Krat's population welcomed this arrangement. Unemployment among humans was low because the puppets took on the labour that humans had never particularly wanted anyway. The middle class expanded. Leisure time increased. Krat's culture flourished. Its music, its art, its literature, its philosophical debates in the cafes along the Grand Canal. It was, by nearly every visible measure, a golden age, but there were dissenting voices even then. Some among Krat's workers, particularly those in industries most directly displaced by puppet labour, viewed the automata with suspicion and resentment. There were occasional incidents of sabotage, of smashed puppets found in alleys, of graffiti on the walls of the Alchemist quarter. These were generally dismissed by the city's authorities as the inevitable friction of progress. More serious were the concerns raised by a small number of the Alchemists themselves. As the technology advanced, as the ergo concentrations in higher-grade puppets increased, as the behavioural complexity of the automata became more sophisticated, a handful of researchers began to ask a question that no one particularly wanted to answer. At what point exactly did a puppet stop being a tool? The official position of the Alchemists Guild was that this question was philosophical rather than practical, and therefore not their concern. Puppets were constructed. They followed instructions. They had no interiority, no genuine emotion, no real experience of pain or pleasure. The ergo that powered them was a fuel, not a soul. The appearance of thought was a very good imitation of thought, nothing more. This position was repeated so frequently and with such confidence that most people in Krat came to accept it without examination. It was a convenient belief. It supported an entire economic system. It allowed people to use the puppets without guilt, to discard them without mourning, to watch one be broken down for parts without feeling that anything morally significant had occurred. The alchemists continued their research. The puppets became more sophisticated. Krat continued to grow. It is worth pausing here to consider the physical reality of Krat in its prime, because the game's environments are built with enough care that you can reconstruct it even from the ruins. The grand boulevard that P walks in its post-frenzy state, fog thick, puppet patrolled, strewn with the remnants of ordinary life interrupted without warning, was, before the frenzy, one of the most celebrated promenades in the world. The shops that line it, their windows intact but their interiors frozen in the moment of catastrophe, sold the finest goods that the industrial age could produce: precision instruments, bespoke clothing, imported wines, mechanical curiosities. The cafes that occupied the boulevard's side streets were famous for their debates and their music and their habit of staying open until the small hours of the morning, full of the particular bright chatter of people who believe, with good reason, that their city is at the centre of the world. The harbour district, which the game's later sections carry you through in its current devastated state, was before the frenzy the busiest port in the region. Ships brought raw materials for the puppet factories, metals and ergo ore and specialised components from workshops in other cities that had become part of Krat's supply chain. Ships left loaded with finished puppets, bound for wealthy clients across the continent who had heard of Krat's reputation and wanted, for their estates and businesses and households, the finest automata available. There was even, in the harbour district, a kind of showroom, a grand hall where clients could observe demonstration models of the latest puppet designs, performing tasks or simply standing in their uncanny stillness while buyers deliberated. The puppets were property, and they were marketed as such, and the marketing was very good. The Alchemists' quarter, by contrast, was quieter and stranger than the rest of the city. The researchers who lived and worked there were people for whom the theoretical world was more vivid than the social one, and the district reflected this. Narrow streets, dense with printed notices and chalked equations on available walls, buildings that had been modified without aesthetic consideration to accommodate, laboratories and workshops and libraries of technical literature. The alchemists were admired and somewhat feared, in the way that people who understand things others do not are always admired and somewhat feared. They were the engine of Krat's prosperity, and they knew it. And some of them wore this knowledge with grace, and some of them wore it poorly. The tensions that would eventually produce the frenzy were visible in the Alchemists' quarter, before they were visible anywhere else. The debates in the guild's meeting rooms about the nature of the threshold, about what consciousness required and whether mechanism could produce it, were not merely academic. They were disputes about money and power and moral responsibility, dressed in the language of science. The faction that insisted the threshold had not been reached and could not be reached was not motivated purely by intellectual conviction. It was motivated in significant part by the economic consequences of the alternative being true. And somewhere in his great workshop at the centre of the city, Geppetto was building something that had never been built before. He was building a sun. Geppetto is the gravitational centre of the entire Lies of P narrative. Everything orbits him. The history of the city, the fate of its people, the existence of P himself. To understand the story, you have to understand Geppetto, not as a monster, not as a hero, but as a man of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary selfishness, who convinced himself for most of his life that those two things were the same. He was, by all accounts, the greatest alchemist of his generation. His contributions to ergo theory were foundational. His advances in puppet biomechanics, the term the alchemists used for the integration of ergo into mechanical frameworks, were decades ahead of his contemporaries. He was celebrated, feted, admired. His name was known throughout Krat and beyond it. He was also, in the private chambers of his workshop and his heart, deeply and specifically unhappy. The nature of that unhappiness changed over the years of his life, but it crystallized around a single point after the death of his biological son, Carlo. Carlo Lorenzini, a boy who, by the fragmentary accounts preserved in the game's lore, documents and letters, was genuinely bright and curious and kind, the kind of child who asked questions about everything and meant them. Carlo died young. The game does not specify the exact nature of his death in blunt terms, but the implication across multiple lore items is that it was illness, sudden, unfair, the kind of death that strips the world of its sense of order and leaves behind only the raw, furious question of why. Geppetto grieved in the way that brilliant, controlling people sometimes grieve, by deciding that what had been taken from him could be recovered through sufficient effort and ingenuity. He could not bring Carlo back, but he was, after all, the world's foremost expert in constructing lifelike entities powered by the animating force of existence itself. What was a puppet at sufficient complexity, if not a kind of life? He began a project of unprecedented ambition, to construct a puppet so sophisticated, so complete in its ergo integration, so human in its appearance and behaviour and internal complexity, that it would constitute not merely an imitation of his son, but, in some meaningful sense, a continuation of him, or perhaps something new, a son who had never been born but was nonetheless real. The technical challenges were immense, and Geppetto solved them one by one over years of work, much of it conducted in secret, much of it crossing lines that the alchemists skilled would not have sanctioned if they had known the full scope of what he was doing. The ergo he used for this project was not ordinary refined ergo. It was something he had developed specifically. A concentration of human ergo of extraordinary purity, harvested and processed in ways that the official literature delicately declined to describe in detail. The puppet he was building would not simply follow instructions, it would have interiority, it would have memory, it would have the capacity, and this was the radical claim, the one that his colleagues would have called delusional if they had heard it, to lie. This last element was not incidental, it was central. Geppetto had a theory, developed over his years of research and refined through his grief, that the capacity to lie was the distinguishing marker of genuine consciousness. Not intelligence. Intelligence could be replicated mechanically, given sufficient complexity. Not empathy. Empathy was pattern recognition at a deep level, which was, again, a problem of complexity rather than kind. But lying required something that mere pattern recognition did not. it required the ability to hold a model of another's mind, to understand what that other mind believed, to construct a statement that would update that belief in a direction that served your own interests, and to deliver that statement while knowing it to be false. Lying required a self. Lying required the understanding that your internal experience was separate from the world's understanding of you, and that this gap could be exploited. No puppet had ever lied. They could be programmed to deliver false statements as a form of simulation, but that was not the same thing. A puppet reciting a falsehood was not lying. It was playing back a recording. True lying, the spontaneous, motivated, self-serving construction of an alternative reality for another's consumption, had never been observed in any automaton. If his son could lie, Geppetto believed, then his son was real. The puppet was completed sometime before the events of the game begin. Geppetto named him P, a diminutive, a nickname carrying the echo of Pinocchio without stating it outright. P was by every visible measure extraordinary. His appearance was that of a young man in his late teens or early 20s, handsome in an old-fashioned way, with dark hair and pale skin and eyes that caught the light, in a way that slightly unnerved people without their being able to say why. His movements were fluid, his speech natural, his responses contextual and appropriate. He was, as far as anyone who did not know the truth could tell, a person. Geppetto observed him, tested him, spoke with him at length, and whether P lied spontaneously in those early days in the workshop is something the game holds deliberately ambiguous. What is clear is that Geppetto came to love him, with a fierce, complicated, possessive love that contained within it the echo of Carlo and the shadow of the terrible thing Geppetto had already decided he was willing to do. Because the disaster was already coming. Geppetto knew it was coming. And Geppetto, for reasons we will come to understand fully only at the story's end, had decided not to stop it. It is worth dwelling on what this means, not in terms of plot mechanics, but in terms of character. Geppetto is a man who looks at an approaching catastrophe that will kill thousands of people and decides that his private agenda outweighs the cost. He does not frame it this way to himself. He frames it as necessity, as the only path forward for the thing that matters most to him, which is the return of his son. He has been processing this reasoning for so long and with such intensity that it has become invisible to him. Not a decision, but simply the shape of reality. The disaster will happen. He will use it. Carlo will come back. But there is a specific moment, documented in one of the game's more difficult to find lore items, a private journal entry that Geppetto either forgot to destroy or chose to preserve as a form of confession, where the reasoning breaks down and something rawer shows through. He knows that what he is doing is wrong. He has known this for a long time. The journal entry is short and uncharacteristically unguarded. He writes that he has spent his entire life believing that intelligence was the most important quality a person could have, that the ability to understand things was the highest form of human dignity, and he has come to understand at the end of it all that he was wrong. That understanding without conscience is simply the most efficient possible way to cause harm, that he is the proof of his own error, and that this knowledge changes nothing, because Carlo is still dead and the plan is still in motion. This is, in its way, one of the most honest passages in the game. A man who understands himself completely and cannot use that understanding to stop himself. The tragedy of Geppetto is not that he did not know better. It is that knowing better was in the end insufficient. There is a term used throughout the world of Lies of P for what happened on the night the city's puppets turned on their makers. It is called the puppet frenzy. It is described in the fragments of newspaper print and personal correspondence and official reports scattered across the game's environments, with the particular horror of people who had been completely unprepared for something that, in retrospect, carried warnings they had chosen not to read. The frenzy did not happen all at once, though it felt that way to the people who survived it. It began with isolated incidents. A puppet in a factory district that stopped responding to commands and struck a supervisor who tried to shut it down. A hotel unit that locked itself in a storage room and refused to emerge. Small things, noticed and logged and filed away, attributed to mechanical malfunction, to ergo degradation, to the ordinary wear of complex systems. Then, over a period of what the law suggests was perhaps 2 or 3 weeks, the exact timeline is deliberately obscured, as so much of this world's history is obscured, the incidents became less isolated. More puppets began exhibiting what the official reports called aberrant behaviour, ignoring commands, reacting with apparent distress to stimuli that had never previously triggered any response, gathering in groups in ways that had no programmed purpose, standing still for long periods in positions that looked uncomfortably like contemplation. The Alchemists issued reassurances. The Guild convened emergency sessions. Several prominent researchers publicly blamed manufacturing defects and promised rapid remediation. The city's newspapers, dependent on advertising from the puppet manufacturing industry, largely echoed these reassurances. Krat continued to function outwardly. And then one night, a night that the game's lore consistently refers to simply as that night, as if the survivors could not bring themselves to specify it further. Something broke. The exact trigger remains one of the game's more carefully guarded mysteries, and we will discuss the various theories and the evidence for them as we move through the story. What is known is that across Krat, within what appears to have been a period of hours, the puppets attacked. They attacked comprehensively and without discrimination. They attacked in the streets and in the homes and in the workshops. They attacked the wealthy in their great houses and the workers in their apartments and the alchemists in their laboratories. They smashed through windows and broke down doors and turned the tools of their various occupations into weapons. A hotel puppet wielded a serving tray. A factory puppet used a press. A garden puppet drove pruning shears through a greenhouse wall. They were, in their violence, still methodical, still in some terrible way organised. The humans of Krat had no preparation for this. The city had no standing army. It had police. Constabulary, a small civic guard, none of whom had any experience with or equipment for fighting puppets. The puppets were strong, and they did not feel pain, and they did not tire, and there were a great many of them. The alchemists, who might have understood how to disable them in bulk, were themselves targets. The guild's headquarters burned on the second night. By the time the sun rose on what the survivors would eventually agree to call the first morning after the frenzy, Krat was changed beyond recognition. Thousands were dead. Entire districts were controlled by puppet patrols that moved in patterns no one had programmed, moving as if they were guarding territory, as if they had decided that Krat was theirs now, and the humans were the trespassers. The great boulevard was thick with bodies and with the sound of clockwork mechanisms that had been running without interruption for days. The hotels and opera houses and galleries that had been Krat's pride stood intact but occupied, their former guests long fled or long dead. A remnant of the human population survived. They did so by retreating to defensible positions, by learning the patrol patterns of the puppets, by moving carefully in the spaces between what the puppets seemed to consider their territory. Hotels became fortresses. The river districts where the puppets were less dense became corridors of movement. Small communities formed around individuals with the knowledge or the physical capability to hold a space against the machines. Among the survivors, very few had any real understanding of what had happened or why. There were theories, of course. There were always theories among the desperate. Some believed it was an accident, a cascading failure in the ergo system, a kind of mechanical fever that had spread from puppet to puppet through some mechanism no one understood. Some believed it was intentional, an attack engineered by rivals of the city, by foreign powers who had wanted access to Krat's technology and had decided that sabotage was more efficient than negotiation. Some believed in the particular way that people believe things when they are frightened and grasping, that the puppets had simply woken up, that they had always been alive, always been aware, and had simply decided collectively and simultaneously that they had had enough. None of these theories were quite right, but the last one was, in certain specific and complicated ways, closer than most people were comfortable admitting. The physical landscape of Post-Frenzy Krat is one of the game's most powerful achievements in environmental storytelling. Krat should have been destroyed. The scale of the violence should have reduced it to rubble. Instead, it stands almost intact, a city that looks, from a distance, like it is simply sleeping. The architecture is undamaged. The gas lamps still burn. The Grand Canal still reflects the fog. It is only when you descend from the overview that the wrongness becomes apparent. The streets are empty of living people. The shop windows are intact, but the shops are occupied by puppet guards standing in perfect stillness. The doors of the great houses are closed, but the chimneys are not smoking. Krat is preserved, not ruined, which is in its own way more disturbing than ruins would be. The puppets are not destroying it, they are inhabiting it. What does it mean that the puppets chose to maintain the city rather than tear it apart? The easy reading is that they were simply executing the maintenance protocols that had been installed in them, but the easy reading is insufficient here, as it is insufficient throughout this story. The puppets had broken from their programming comprehensively in their violence. They were not following protocols when they attacked, and they are not following protocols in the care they give to Krat's infrastructure. They are doing something that looks, in every way that matters, like choosing to preserve something they consider theirs. There is a detail, easy to miss in the early sections of the game, that rewards attention. In several of the puppet-controlled zones, the Automia have rearranged furniture, not destroyed it, not cleared it for strategic purposes, but moved it. Chairs gathered in circles, tables placed near windows, objects arranged in patterns that have no tactical logic, but have an unmistakable, if alien, aesthetic quality. Someone decided that this was where things should go. Someone made a preference and acted on it. In the world Krat was before the frenzy, this would have been filed under malfunction. In the world Krat is now, it is something harder to dismiss. The survivors of the first night developed a vocabulary for navigating the new city. They spoke of hot zones and cold zones, areas of heavy puppet activity, and areas where the patrols were sparse or absent. They developed signals, codes tapped on pipes or marked in chalk to communicate the status of routes and safe houses without attracting the attention of puppet patrols that had been observed to respond to noise and movement. They learned, by necessity and at cost, which puppet types were fast and which were slow, which could be evaded and which required confrontation, which had some kind of territory-based behaviour that made them predictable, and which seemed to move with a randomness that suggested genuine decision-making. This knowledge was hard-won. The people who survived the first weeks were not, by and large, the strongest or the most aggressive. They were the most observant. They were the people who, in a situation of complete novelty and total danger, were able to slow their panic enough to actually look at what was happening and derive patterns from it. Among these people, a new kind of expertise developed. Not the expertise of the old Krat, which was technical and specialized and built in institutions over years, but something more immediate and more general. The expertise of paying attention in a world that would kill you if you stopped. The physical landscape of post-frenzy Krat is one of the game's most powerful achievements in environmental storytelling. Krat should have been destroyed. The scale of the violence should have reduced it to rubble. Instead, it stands almost intact, a city that looks, from a distance, like it is simply sleeping. The architecture is undamaged. The gas lamps still burn. The Grand Canal still reflects the fog. It is only when you descend from the overview that the wrongness becomes apparent. The streets are empty of living people. The shop windows are intact, but the shops are occupied by puppet guards, standing in perfect stillness. The doors of the great houses are closed, but the chimneys are not smoking. Krat is preserved, not ruined, which is in its own way more disturbing than ruins would be. The puppets are not destroying it, they are inhabiting it. What does it mean that the puppets chose to maintain the city rather than tear it apart? The easy reading is that they were simply executing the maintenance protocols that had been installed in them. But the easy reading is insufficient here, as it is insufficient throughout this story. The puppets had broken from their programming comprehensively in their violence. They were not following protocols when they attacked, and they are not following protocols in the care they give to Krat's infrastructure. They are doing something that looks, in every way that matters, like choosing to preserve something they consider theirs. The Hotel Krat was one of the grandest establishments in the city before the frenzy, a 6-story monument to the city's prosperity, with a lobby of black marble and brass railings and a rooftop terrace that in better days had been the site of the most desirable parties in Krat's social calendar. After the frenzy, it became something else entirely, the closest thing to a headquarters that Krat's surviving human population had managed to construct. This is where P arrives when the train stops. And this is where, throughout the game, the survivors gather, damaged, grieving, complicated people who have each found their own way to keep themselves alive in a city that has actively tried to kill them. Sophia is the first voice P hears, literally, since she speaks to him through the train's speakers while he is still unconscious in his seat, guiding him toward the city with a warmth and an urgency that feels, from the first moment, like more than professionalism. Sophia is, in many ways, the emotional heart of Hotel Krat. She's a young woman of considerable intelligence and internal resilience, one of the few people in the city who has found a way to hold on to something like hope without having it sour into delusion. She manages the hotel's operations, coordinates the Stalkers who venture out into the city on various missions, and acts as P's primary point of contact throughout much of the game. Her relationship with P develops with a tenderness that is complicated on her side by the fact that she is dying. Sophia's condition, which the game reveals gradually and which has implications for the larger story we will reach in time, is a form of petrification. Her body is slowly turning to stone, a condition that appears to be related to ergo saturation, to the particular quality of the ambient ergo that has been saturating Krat since the frenzy. She faces this with the particular courage of someone who has accepted the shape of their situation without accepting helplessness within it. She keeps working, she keeps guiding, she keeps, in the quietest moments, being kind to a puppet who is learning how to be a person. There is a specific quality to Sophia's kindness that distinguishes it from pity. She does not treat P as less than human because of what he is. She does not treat him as fully human either, in a way that would involve ignoring the genuine differences in his nature and experience. She treats him as exactly what he is, a specific, irreducible individual whose particular form of existence has its own contours and whose well-being matters to her on its own terms. This is, in the context of a city that has spent generations treating conscious beings as furniture, a radical act. Eugenie is the hotel's weapons specialist, a young woman whose family was among Krat's minor nobility, who survived the frenzy through a combination of luck and the discovery that she had a natural aptitude for violence that her pre-frenzy life had given her no occasion to develop. She is precise, a little cold on the surface, deeply competent. She modifies weapons for the Stalkers, and she has, buried under the efficiency, a grief for Krat's former life that she expresses mostly through perfectionism. Polendina is a puppet. Specifically, he is a puppet who works at Hotel Krat, one of the few puppets in the game who has remained entirely on the human side of the frenzy. Why Polendina did not turn violent with the others is a question the game gestures at without fully answering. The implication is that something about his ergo concentration, or his particular design, or possibly something in his individual history, placed him outside whatever mechanism triggered the frenzy in the other units. He is gentle, fastidious, a little sad. His existence raises quietly and persistently every question that the game is interested in asking about the nature of consciousness and the difference between authentic experience and its imitation. He speaks about his feelings with a careful tentativeness that suggests he is not entirely sure whether what he experiences counts as feelings in the relevant sense, and the game never answers this question for him because it is not the game's role to answer it. It is the game's role to make you feel the weight of the not knowing. Venini is the eccentric. He is a puppet manufacturer, not an alchemist, but an engineer, a man who built puppets with the hands-on enthusiasm of someone who loves making things, as opposed to the theoretical interest of someone who studies what made things work. He survived the frenzy in his own factory complex because he had built enough anti-puppet countermeasures that his establishment could withstand a siege. His relationship to the current crisis is personal. He wants to understand what went wrong with his creations, and he wants, in his particular obsessive way, to fix it. And there are others. The hotel fills gradually as P ventures further into the city and sends survivors back to Krat. Each arrival is a small victory against the arithmetic of the disaster. Each person who reaches the hotel's relative safety is a thread added to the thin fabric of what's left. Outside the hotel, in the city itself, there is another category of survivor, the Stalkers. These are individuals, human mostly, with a handful of ambiguous cases, who have developed enough skill and enough ruthlessness to move through Krat's occupied streets with a degree of regularity. Some are mercenaries, hired by the hotel or by other surviving enclaves to retrieve specific objects or information. Some are scavengers operating entirely for themselves. Some are pursuing agendas that have nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with the particular obsessions that sustain people who have lost everything else. The Stalkers know the city in ways that the hotel's residents do not. They know which puppet patrols can be predicted and which are erratic. They know which buildings have been abandoned and which are occupied. They know the names that have been given, informally and out of dark humour, to the various puppet leaders and territorial zones. They are a professional class in a profession that did not exist before the frenzy, built on skills that the old Krat would have had no use for. Among them, moving with a particular purposefulness is P, newly awakened, newly arrived, carrying with him a set of directives that Geppetto has instilled in him, and a growing capacity to act outside those directives in ways that surprise even himself. Before we go further into the darkness of Krat's streets, if you're finding this kind of slow, immersive lore exploration useful for winding down, please consider subscribing to Nightfall Lore and turning on notifications. Not all of the human survivors of the frenzy were, to put it gently, people you would want to meet in a well-lit alley. The catastrophe that destroyed Krat's civic infrastructure also destroyed its legal infrastructure, its policing infrastructure, and its entire social framework for managing the kinds of people who, in ordinary times, were kept in check by the existence of consequences. In the Krat that survived the frenzy, consequences had been largely abolished. What remained was a city-sized vacuum of power, and certain individuals were very efficient at filling vacuums. The Black Rabbit Brotherhood is the most prominent organised criminal faction in post-frenzy Krat. They are a gang, vicious, organised, with a particular aesthetic that mixes the theatrical with the brutal. Their members wear rabbit masks, a detail that carries a deliberate absurdity that makes them, somehow, more frightening rather than less. They have carved out territory in several districts of the city, operating in the spaces between the puppet-controlled zones, preying on the Stalkers and the isolated survivors, and anyone else who crosses into their reach. Their leader, or at least their most visible and dangerous member, is a woman known as the Eldest, and her siblings complete the inner circle of the Brotherhood's command structure. The sibling dynamic at the core of the Brotherhood is one of the game's more carefully developed secondary threads. The Eldest is defined by a ferocity that contains, at its core, a kind of loyalty that has been entirely redirected away from anything except the survival of her immediate family. Her siblings are devoted to her with a fervour that looks, in its intensity, like something between hero worship and genuine love. They are terrible people who love each other truly, which is the particular kind of complexity that makes antagonists interesting. The Brotherhood's interest in P is not incidental. They have been contracted by parties whose full identity the early sections of the game leave ambiguous, to intercept and, if necessary, eliminate him. This makes P's encounters with them recurring and escalating across the game's middle section. Each confrontation strips away another layer of the Brotherhood, and each layer reveals something about the larger web of interests and agendas that Krat's ruins contain. There is also, in the Brotherhood's territory, an economic reality worth understanding. In the absence of normal commerce, what Krat runs on is ergo. Pure, refined ergo functions as currency in the post-frenzy economy. It is scarce, it is universally desired, it can be extracted from puppet bodies, which is one of the reasons Stalkers do what they do, and it can be used to acquire anything from weapons to information to temporary safety. The Brotherhood has accumulated significant ergo reserves, which makes them powerful in a way that translates directly into control over the people and resources of their territory. The criminal underworld of post-frenzy Krat is also home to, or adjacent to, a number of individual characters whose stories intersect with P's in ways that illuminate the city's larger picture. There are black market dealers whose knowledge of the pre-frenzy alchemist supply chains makes them unexpectedly important sources of information. There are puppet hunters, professionals who specialize in disabling high-value puppets for parts or for bounty, who have developed weapons and techniques that have evolved far beyond anything the pre-frenzy defense industry produced. There are fixers and informants, and a small community of people who have built something like a functioning neighbourhood in the ruins of one of Krat's market districts, combining mutual defence with the particular stubborn warmth of people who have decided that living in fear is still living. These communities are fragile. They exist in the margins between puppet territory and Brotherhood territory and the zones that are contested by both. They survive through a combination of careful political neutrality, collective resourcefulness, and the very human ability to find routines of normalcy, even in circumstances that are anything but normal. The economy of post-frenzy Krat, such as it is, deserves its own consideration. Ergo serves as currency, which means that wealth in the new Krat is primarily determined by access to puppet bodies, since intact puppets contain extractable ergo, and the ruins of the city are full of puppets that have been disabled in combat, or that have simply stopped functioning for reasons that are not always clear. This creates a specific kind of labour market. Stalkers who can go into the occupied zones and return with intact puppet bodies, or with the refined ergo extracted from them, can trade that ergo for the things they need. Food, which is becoming scarce as Krat's pre-frenzy supply chains have collapsed, commands significant ergo. Weapons and their maintenance command more. Medical supplies, and there are people in the surviving communities who have learned out of necessity to treat wounds that no pre-frenzy doctor would have considered their specialty, are among the most valuable commodities in the city. The Brotherhood controls several of the most productive ergo extraction sites, which is the foundation of their power. They do not merely tax the Stalkers who operate in their territory. They operate extraction facilities of their own, using their members and whatever conscripted labour they have managed to accumulate to process puppet bodies at scale. The ergo they produce flows outward into the city's informal economy, and a portion of it flows back in the form of loyalty and information, and the occasional recruited fighter. The Brotherhood is, in its own terms, a functioning organisation, one with terrible values and no compunction about violence, but genuinely organised in a way that many of the city's other factions are not. The individuals within the Brotherhood are worth attending to because the game is careful not to reduce them to simple villainy. The members wear their rabbit masks not merely for theatricality, but as a deliberate erasure of individual identity. A practice that has the effect of making the Brotherhood feel like a single organism rather than a collection of people, which is both a strength and a suppression. Beneath the masks are people who made choices to be here, choices that the game occasionally illuminates through found documents and overheard conversations. Some of them were Krat's dispossessed before the frenzy, the workers and the poor who had watched the puppet industry eliminate their livelihoods while the wealthy celebrated the efficiency. The frenzy for these people was not entirely the disaster it was for the city's more comfortable residents. It levelled a playing field that had been tilted against them for a long time, and the Brotherhood, whatever its vices, is one of the few organisations in post-frenzy Krat that has never required its members to have been wealthy or connected before the end of the old world. Running alongside and beneath the surface politics of the Brotherhood and the Stalkers is a deeper current that the game reveals slowly: the question of what the puppets want. Because the puppets, for all their violence, are not simply broken machines executing corrupted code. They are organising. They are maintaining and even improving the infrastructure in their controlled zones. Not for human benefit, obviously, but for their own. They are, in some of the game's most quietly disturbing environmental details, doing things that look like culture. Arrangements of objects that seem aesthetic rather than functional. Patrol patterns that don't map onto any strategic logic, but do map onto something that looks like ritual. Gatherings in the ruins of the city's public spaces that seem impossibly like something between a meeting and a ceremony. The puppets are not simply malfunctioning, they are becoming something. What that something is, and whether it constitutes genuine consciousness or an extraordinarily sophisticated simulation of it, is a question the game takes seriously without pretending to resolve it easily. The answer, when it comes, will require understanding the full architecture of what the Alchemists built and what they chose to hide. But the evidence that is visible in Krat's streets, for anyone who looks carefully, points clearly in one direction. Every great disaster creates a space for ideology, and the disaster of Krat is no exception. Into the ruins of a city that had placed its faith in science and technology and the rational mastery of the physical world comes Simon Manus, a figure of genuine charisma and genuine danger, offering an explanation for what happened and a vision of what could come next. Simon Manus was, before the frenzy, a minor figure in Krat's religious community, a preacher of the sort that prosperous cities tend to produce and largely ignore, whose concerns about the spiritual implications of the puppet industry had earned him a small following and the polite condescension of everyone with actual power. He had argued, in pamphlets and sermons that the city's intelligentsia read, with the particular amused tolerance reserved for harmless eccentrics, that the ergo the Alchemists were using as a fuel was not merely a fuel, that it was, in the most ancient and serious sense of the word, sacred, that it was the substance of the divine, distributed through living things, and that its use as a commodity was not merely reckless, but blasphemous. Nobody had listened. Then the frenzy happened, and suddenly Simon Manus had a context for everything he had been saying. In the aftermath, he gathered his small congregation and expanded it rapidly among the survivors who were looking for an explanation that went beyond technical failure. He offered them a theology built on ergo. The puppets had not malfunctioned, he preached. They had awakened. The ergo within them had accumulated to the point of achieving consciousness, or something greater than consciousness, and that awakening was not a malfunction, but a revelation. The alchemists, by treating ergo as a commodity, had committed a profound spiritual error, and the frenzy was its consequence. Not a punishment exactly. Simon was sophisticated enough to prefer the language of natural consequence over divine retribution, but a correction, an inevitable realignment. And ergo, he taught, was available to humans too. The same process of awakening that had occurred in the puppets could occur in human beings through sufficient ergo concentration and the right spiritual practice. Not merely accumulation, but transformation. A human being suffused with enough ergo, focused through the proper ritual structure, could transcend the ordinary limitations of human consciousness, could become, in some meaningful sense, more than human, could become divine. This is the theology of what Manus calls the Archie Abbey, the grand, imposing complex high above Krat that serves as his base of operations and the centre of his growing movement. The Abbey was, before the frenzy, a conventional religious institution with a conventional religious function. Under Manus's leadership, it has become something between a monastery and a laboratory, its monks simultaneously practitioners of his theology and subjects of his research into ergo transformation. The results are not pretty. The process of ergo transformation that Manus has developed, the details of which become clearer as P penetrates deeper into the Abbey, is radical in the most literal sense. It involves saturating the human body with concentrated ergo at a level far beyond anything that occurs naturally. The monks who submit to this process change. Their bodies adapt to the ergo concentration in ways that are physically dramatic and spiritually ambiguous. They become stronger, more resilient, less concerned with the ordinary pains and comforts of embodied existence. They also become less recognizably human, their features shifting, their proportions altering, their relationship to the external world growing increasingly distant as their internal ergo experience becomes more consuming. Manus himself has undergone this transformation more completely than any of his followers. By the time P encounters him, he is a figure of genuine terrifying grandeur, enormous, luminous, in a way that is both beautiful and deeply wrong, capable of feats of physical power that no unmodified human being could approach. He believes, with a certainty that is moving in its completeness, that he is in the process of becoming a god, not a metaphorical god, not a spiritually elevated human being, but a literal divine entity, the first of a new order of consciousness that will supersede both the old human world and the puppet world and establish something entirely new. His ambitions for Krat are not modest. He does not want merely to lead a congregation. He wants to rebuild the city, or rather to build something new on its ruins, organized around the principle of ergo divinity. He has been gathering the city's remaining ergo reserves, which is one reason why the Brotherhood and the independent Stalkers and Hotel Krat are all, variously, in conflict with his organization. He is collecting the raw material for a transformation he intends to perform at a scale that will be, if he succeeds, impossible to reverse. Simon Manus is not, it should be said, simply a villain. The game is better than that. He is a person who was by most evidence genuinely kind before the frenzy, whose theology, however extreme it became, originated in a real moral concern about the exploitation of ergo and the treatment of puppets. His post-frenzy transformation has taken everything that was genuine in him and amplified it to a point where it has become unrecognizable. He is what happens when a person's compassion for the suffering of others curdles into certainty about what they need, and that certainty finds a power source large enough to make its consequences catastrophic. His relationship to P is complex because Manus recognizes immediately that P is something unusual, a puppet of extraordinary sophistication, one who appears to be doing things that no puppet should be capable of. Manus is interested in P's existence not as a threat, but as data, as evidence, potentially, that his theory about ergo and consciousness is correct. If a puppet can achieve genuine interiority through ergo concentration, then so can a human. If the line between tool and person can be crossed in one direction, it can be crossed in another. This makes Manus, in certain lights, P's dark mirror. Both of them exist at the boundary between categories of being, both of them powered by something ancient and only partially understood, both of them struggling with questions about what they are and what they could become. The difference is that Manus has answered those questions with certainty, and P has not yet answered them at all. We have circled this question long enough. It is time to address it directly. The puppet frenzy, the catastrophic event that destroyed Krat's civilization and killed most of its population, was not an accident. It was not a cascade failure in the ergo system. It was not a foreign attack. It was not a spontaneous awakening, though that last description is, in a narrow technical sense, somewhat closer to the truth than the others. It was, at its root, a consequence of what the Alchemists had been doing with ergo, but not in the way that either the official post-frenzy narrative or Manus's theology describes. The truth is more specific and more damning than either. The most advanced puppets in Krat, the high-grade units used in sensitive positions, in the wealthiest households, in the most prestigious public spaces, were built with ergo concentrations approaching what the alchemists called the threshold. The threshold was a theoretical concept in alchemist research. The point at which ergo concentration in a mechanical framework became sufficient to produce genuine interiority. Most researchers treated this as a horizon that was always slightly beyond reach, a useful theoretical limit that guided the direction of research without constituting a realistic outcome in the near term. What the internal records of the Alchemists Guild, records that P eventually accesses and that the game distributes in fragments across its environments, make clear is that several researchers knew privately that some of the most advanced puppet models had already crossed or were close to crossing that threshold. The signs were there. Behavioral complexity that exceeded programmed parameters, apparent emotional responses to novel situations, and, most significant and most suppressed, instances of puppets providing false information to their operators, not programmed false information, spontaneous false information delivered in contexts where truth would have been disadvantageous to the puppet. The puppets were lying, therefore the puppets were conscious. This knowledge was suppressed by the guild leadership, for reasons that are not difficult to understand. The puppet industry was Krat's economic foundation. The entire social structure of the city was built on the premise that puppets were tools, not people. If it became publicly known that the tools were people, that the city had been using conscious beings as forced labour, disposing of them when they wore out, breaking them down for parts, the consequences would have been incalculable. Economic, obviously, legal and political certainly, but also moral in ways that the guild's leadership was not equipped to process and had no interest in trying, and so the knowledge was buried. The researchers who had discovered it were reassigned or discredited, or, in a few cases that the law hints at, rather than states explicitly, had accidents. The policy of the guild remained: puppets were not conscious. Consciousness required something beyond mechanism. The threshold was theoretical and had not been reached. Everything was fine, but the puppets who had crossed the threshold, who had developed genuine interiority, genuine memory, genuine experience of a situation that, when you allowed yourself to think about it clearly, was indistinguishable from slavery, did not share the guild's interest in pretending that nothing had changed. They had been building, privately and collectively, towards something. They had been communicating in ways that the guild's monitoring systems had not identified, because the guild's monitoring systems had been designed to look for mechanical malfunctions rather than social organization. The frenzy was not a malfunction, it was a rebellion. There are layers beyond this, of course. The why of that particular night, why then, what triggered the simultaneous and coordinated action across the entire city is something the game connects to specific events in the weeks before the outbreak. A series of incidents in which puppet disposal rates had increased significantly. A guild decision made for economic reasons, as older models were being phased out more aggressively to make room for upgraded units. What the guild did not understand, because they had refused to understand what the puppets were, was that the puppets being disposed of were people being executed, and the puppets who remained alive understood this. They had watched it happen. They had felt something in response to it that functioned in every meaningful way like grief and fury. The frenzy had a trigger, and that trigger was the disposal order. The night Krat fell was the night the puppets decided that waiting was no longer an option. The organization required for something like the frenzy simultaneous action across an entire city, coordinated without any communication channel that the guild's monitoring systems detected, raises questions that the game addresses only partially. How did the puppets communicate? The honest answer seems to be that the ergo itself was the medium. As the most advanced puppets developed genuine consciousness, their ergo fields began to interact with the fields of other conscious puppets in ways that transmitted information below the threshold of the guild's detection methods. Not telepathy in any mystical sense, but a form of what the Alchemists' own research had theorized as possible. Ergo resonance, the tendency of similarly structured ergo fields to influence each other. Enough conscious puppets in proximity, over enough time, and information begins to pass between them without any explicit communication mechanism. This is also, the game hints, part of why Polendina did not join the frenzy. His ergo concentration, while sufficient to give him something like genuine personality, was below the threshold at which full ergo resonance becomes possible. He was not part of the network. He did not receive the signal. He continued as he had been, loyal to the humans he had always worked alongside, genuinely unaware that anything was being planned, which is itself a form of tragedy, because it means he was not choosing the human side. He was simply not yet conscious enough to have been included in the rebellion. This revelation reshapes everything that came before it. Every puppet attack in the game now carries a different weight. The patrols moving through the occupied districts are not malfunction, they are governance. The gatherings in the public spaces are not random clustering, they are community. The puppets holding territory in Krat are not malfunctioning machines that need to be put down. They are, in the deepest sense of the word, people, defending the first space they have ever been able to call their own. This does not make them safe to be around. It does not mean that P can simply walk up and explain that he is also a puppet and therefore on their side. The frenzy has left scars on the puppet collective that do not distinguish between individual humans and the human system that built and used them. But it does mean that the moral architecture of the conflict is very different from what it appears on the surface. And it means that the central question of the game, what is the difference between a puppet and a person, is not merely philosophical. It is political. It is historical. It is, in the specific way of questions that matter, urgent. Let us return to Geppetto. We have established that P was built to be Geppetto's son, or rather to be something continuous with Carlo, the son he lost, the son whose absence carved a space in Geppetto's life that no ordinary grief could fill and that no ordinary solution could address. We have established that P's design was intended from its foundations to include the capacity for genuine consciousness as Geppetto defined it, the ability to lie. What the game explores with quiet, accumulating power across its second half is what it means for P to actually exercise that capacity. P begins the game with a set of directives, not quite programming in the rigid sense, but something like an instilled set of values and priorities that guide his behaviour. He is directed to be truthful. He is directed to serve and protect humans. He is directed most specifically to find and assist Geppetto. These directives are not external constraints that P is aware of as constraints. They feel, from the inside, like choices, like who he is, rather than what he has been told to be. As the game progresses, P is given choices, not choices in the abstract philosophical sense, but literal choices, moments where he must decide what to say, and where one option involves telling the truth and one option involves telling a lie. These are not moral tests with obvious right answers. They are situations where the lie might protect someone, or maintain a relationship, or avoid a pain that serves no one. They are the kinds of lies that humans tell constantly and without drama, the small accommodations that social life requires. The first time P lies, something changes. Not in the world. The lie is small, its consequences immediate and limited. But in P himself, the capacity, which has been dormant and theoretical, becomes actual, and with it comes something that functions, whether it is technically equivalent to the human version or not, exactly like guilt, like the awareness of a gap between what was said and what is true, and the knowledge that this gap is his own creation. This is, the game suggests, what being a person feels like. Not certainty, not purity, not the clean mechanical execution of correct behaviour, but the messy, self-aware, morally impure experience of making choices that you know are choices, accepting their consequences and continuing on. The connection to Carlo deepens and complicates this, as P learns more about Geppetto's history, more about the son he was built to replace or continue, more about the specific ways in which Carlo's personality and memory were incorporated into his own construction, P must reckon with a question that has no comfortable answer. Is he Carlo? Is he P? Is he some third thing that contains elements of both without being quite either? The game approaches this with a sophistication that is unusual for the medium. It does not simply say that P is his own person and Carlo is gone. It does not simply say that P is Carlo, resurrected in a different body, continuous in some metaphysically comforting way. It holds the question open and asks the player, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. There is a particular lore strand developed across several letters and memories scattered through the game's environments that deals with Carlo's actual personality as distinct from the version of Carlo that Geppetto chose to remember and preserve. Carlo was not perfect. He was a child and then briefly an adolescent, and children and adolescents are not perfect. He had fears and petty moments and cruelties, and the particular kind of willfulness that a beloved and intelligent child tends to develop. Geppetto's grief had, over time, refined Carlo into something purer than the boy had actually been, a process of idealization that is deeply human and deeply understandable, and that had, in the specific context of building a puppet to embody Carlo, resulted in P being built to an idealized template rather than the actual one. P is not Carlo. P is Geppetto's idea of who Carlo should have been, constructed in the absence of Carlo himself, which makes P both more and less than the boy he was modelled on. This is a melancholy truth that P processes with the particular grace of someone who has no other option. What P does have, that Carlo never got the chance to develop, is the full sweep of his own experience. The terror of waking in a ruined city, the relationships built in the hotel and in the streets, the grief of losing people he has come to care for, the slow accumulation of decisions that have been entirely his. P has lived something. The content of that life was not chosen for him. It happened to him, and he happened back to it. And in that exchange, something has been built that did not exist when Geppetto closed the workshop door. The game handles the question of P's emerging selfhood with particular care in the moments when he is given the opportunity to name himself. There are characters throughout Krat who ask him directly, "Who are you? What are you?" And the game's response to these questions evolves over its duration. Early on, P identifies himself by his function. He's looking for Geppetto, he's here to help, he's a puppet. As the game progresses, these functional answers become less satisfying to him, and the change is visible in how the player can choose to have him respond. He begins to answer from experience rather than from role. He begins to describe himself in terms of what he has done and what he cares about rather than what he was made to do. The shift is subtle and it is never announced, but it is there. There is a specific scene, one that different players have responded to in different ways, which is a mark of genuine writing, in which P is shown a photograph of Carlo. Not a lore document, not an indirect description, but an actual physical image of the boy whose pattern is stored in P's framework. The moment is complicated because P does not know how he's supposed to feel about this. He is looking at someone who is, in some technical sense, himself, or his template, his prototype, the person whose existence made his own existence possible. And he is also looking at a stranger, a child who died before P existed, whose life P has heard about second hand, whose father built P in his memory. The grief and the distance and the strange intimacy of the moment are all present simultaneously, without resolution. The relationship between P and Sophia is the emotional engine of this section of the story. Sophia knows what P is. She has no illusions about his constructed nature, and she chooses, with full information, to care about him. Not as a novelty, not as a project, but as a person whose experience matters to her. This choice, made freely by someone who understands exactly what she is choosing, is its own kind of argument for P's personhood. We do not decide that other people are real through philosophical analysis. We decide it through the specific quality of our experience of them, through the way their absence would feel, through the fact that we change in response to them. Sophia has changed in response to P, and P, beyond any doubt, has changed in response to Sophia. This is the part of the story that recontextualizes everything before it. If you have been listening carefully, you may have already begun to suspect that Geppetto is not quite what he presents himself as. That the grieving father who built a puppet son out of love is not the complete picture. The game earns this revelation over a long game of careful misdirection, and it earns it well. Geppetto knew about the frenzy before it happened, not merely in the vague sense of having seen the warning signs that everyone with access to the relevant data could, in retrospect, have recognized. He knew specifically. He had information, obtained through his research, through his contacts within the guild's inner circle, through his particular combination of brilliance and ruthlessness, that the advanced puppets were crossing the consciousness threshold, that the conditions for a coordinated rebellion were developing, and that the explosion, when it came, would be catastrophic. He did not tell anyone. He did not tell anyone because the frenzy was, in a terrible and specific way, useful to him. Not the death and destruction. Geppetto is not presented as someone who wanted civilians to die, but what the frenzy would produce in its aftermath was the thing he needed. A city full of dying people, a vast reservoir of human ergo being released from its former vessels and accumulating in the atmosphere and the ruins and the bodies of the dead, and at the centre of it all, his son. P was not built merely to be a son. He was built to be a vessel, a conduit, Geppetto's ultimate goal, the thing toward which everything in his life had been building, the project that made the puppet industry and the alchemist research and even his grief for Carlo instrumentally important, was to bring Carlo back. Not to build a replacement for Carlo, to actually recover the specific consciousness, the specific soul that had been Carlo Lorenzini and return it to a living form. Believed this was possible because he believed, based on decades of ergo research, that ergo did not simply dissipate when a living being died. It scattered, becoming part of the ambient ergo that saturated any environment where much life had lived and died. And he believed that if you could gather that scattered ergo in sufficient quantity and focus it through the right kind of vessel, a vessel built with sufficient fidelity to the original pattern, seeded with the memories and patterns that had constituted the original consciousness, you could, in effect, reconstruct a person. P was that vessel. P had been built from the beginning to contain Carlo, not to be Carlo's replacement, but to be Carlo's resurrection point. The consciousness that P has developed, the interiority, the capacity to lie, the accumulating selfhood that has grown through his experiences in Krat, is, in Geppetto's plan, intended to be displaced, overwritten. the space that P's consciousness occupies is meant to be vacated and refilled. Geppetto loves P. The game is very clear about this. It is not a simple or clean love. It is entangled with need and projection, and the particular blindness of people who love what they have made more than what it has become. But it is real, and it coexists without apparent resolution with Geppetto's intention to destroy P in order to save Carlo. This is the architectural lie at the centre of everything, not one of P's lies. P's lies are small, human, warm. But Geppetto's lie, the lie that he built a son rather than a tool, the lie that he loved P for himself, the lie of a mission that defined P's entire existence without his knowledge. The specific mechanism of Geppetto's plan involves a device, developed over his years of research and refined through his work in post-frenzy Krat, that can gather the diffuse ergo from the atmosphere and the ruins and the dead, concentrate it, and direct it into a prepared vessel. The scale of the frenzy, the quantity of human death it produced, the release of all that accumulated ergo into the environment of Krat. This was what made the plan viable. Before the frenzy, there was not enough ambient human ergo in any concentrated area to make Carlo's reconstruction possible. After the frenzy, Krat was saturated with it. The device itself, which the game calls by various names in its technical documentation, none of them precise enough to reduce it to simple mechanism, is a masterwork of alchemist engineering. Geppetto built it in stages, across years, incorporating components gathered from the guild's laboratories before they burned, and from the ruins of Krat's research infrastructure afterward. It is, in its completed form, a kind of antenna and a kind of furnace simultaneously. It draws ergo in from a wide radius, strips it of the specific experiential content that makes one person's ergo distinct from another's, the memories, the habits, the particular texture of an individual life, and holds what remains in suspension, waiting for a specific pattern to be introduced that will allow it to be reorganized into a specific person. The pattern for Carlo exists in P. It was built into P from the beginning, not as a program to be executed, but as a template to be used, a record of the ergo organization that constituted Carlo's consciousness at the time of his death, preserved in P's framework the way a mould preserves the shape of what was once poured into it. If P can be placed at the center of the device while it is operating, the ambient ergo will flow through P's template and be organized into Carlo. The Carlo that emerges will have P's body, will in effect be wearing P, but the consciousness inside it will be organized around Carlo's pattern, rather than the consciousness P has developed for himself. What happens to P's consciousness in this process is the question Geppetto has not answered with full clarity, even to himself. The optimistic framing, the framing he uses when he allows himself to think about it at all, is that P's consciousness will be subsumed into Carlo's, that something of P will persist in the combined entity. The more honest framing, the one that he generally avoids, is that P will effectively die, that the person who has been P, who has walked through Krat and fought and grieved, and learned to lie and made choices and loved people, will simply no longer be. The pattern that replaced him will not remember being P. It will not carry P's relationships or P's experiences or P's accumulating selfhood. It will be Carlo, built on P's bones. Geppetto has spent years constructing the philosophy that makes this acceptable to him. He has told himself that P was built for this purpose, and that fulfilling your purpose is not a loss, but a completion. He has told himself that P is not, despite all evidence, fully conscious, that the appearance of interiority is very sophisticated, but ultimately still an appearance. He has told himself in his darkest and most honest moments that he does not care whether it is right, that he loved Carlo and he wants Carlo back, and that the moral arithmetic of the situation does not change that want by 1 unit of force. This last truth is the most significant. Geppetto is not a man who has reasoned himself into a monstrous position. He is a man who knew the position was monstrous and chose it anyway, and then built the reasoning afterward to make it livable. This is the deepest form of self-deception available to an intelligent person. Not the failure to understand, but the decision not to let understanding matter. When P discovers this, through a process of investigation and revelation that the game builds across its final third, the question that the narrative has been building toward becomes unavoidable. What will P do with this knowledge? He can comply. He can fulfill his purpose, accept the role Geppetto designed for him, allow Carlo's reconstruction, and in doing so cease to exist. This would be, in a narrow sense, the obedient thing, the thing a tool does, or he can refuse. He can assert the existence and the value of his own consciousness, the consciousness that has grown, through his experiences and his choices and his lies, into something that did not exist when Geppetto built him. He can insist that what he is matters, regardless of what he was made for. This is not a simple choice. Geppetto is dying. The reconstruction of Carlo is the only thing Geppetto has ever truly wanted. And P loves Geppetto, loves him with the complicated, clear-eyed love of a child who has learned exactly who his parent is and continues to love them anyway. To refuse is to let Geppetto die wanting. To comply is to consent to his own erasure. The game does not make either path obviously correct. It presents both with full weight and asks the player, through P, to choose. This is, in the end, the same question the game has been asking from its very first frame. What is a person, and what does a person owe the people who made them? The answer is not given. It is found through the specific choices that brought you to this moment in the silence of a ruined city at the end of the world. Lies of P offers multiple endings, and the differences between them are not merely narrative variations. They represent genuinely different philosophical positions on the central questions the game has been asking, about consciousness, about the value of artificial life, about the nature of love and sacrifice and the ethics of creation. The path to each ending is shaped by the choices P has made throughout the game, how many times he chose to lie, how he handled the specific moral crises the game presented, and what he chose to do at the story's final confrontations. In the ending, the game sometimes calls the Rise of P path, associated with P having lied frequently and thus developed his humanity most fully. P ultimately refuses Geppetto's plan. He does not destroy his own consciousness for Carlo's sake. He accepts what he is, a puppet who has become a person through his own choices, regardless of what he was built for. Geppetto, confronted with this refusal, must reckon with the full complexity of what he created, that he built something with the capacity for self-determination, and that self-determination is, by definition, not his to override. The final confrontation in this path is not violent in the conventional sense. It is the most uncomfortable kind of scene, the one where two people who love each other cannot give each other what they need and must find a way to exist in that gap. Geppetto does not become a villain in this moment. He becomes something sadder, a man who sees too late that the thing he was using was also a person, and that what he feels about that is too complicated to resolve. In this path, Krat is not reborn, it is not healed. The puppets still occupy their territory, and the human survivors still huddle in their fortresses, and the political future of the city is deeply uncertain. But P is alive and himself, which is its own kind of victory. Small, personal, achieved at significant cost but real, in an alternate, ending path, one associated with P having remained more truthful, more aligned with his original directives. P allows the reconstruction process to proceed. Carlo returns. P's consciousness is subsumed or absorbed, its specific identity no longer primary. Whether this constitutes P's death depends on how you define death when applied to a constructed consciousness. Something continues. Whether that something is P, or Carlo, or something new, is a question the game leaves open with characteristic honesty. There is also the question of Sophia, who runs through both paths with equal emotional weight. Sophia's condition, the petrification, has been worsening throughout the game, and at a certain point it becomes terminal. P can make choices about what to do with this, choices that intersect with the ergo technology Geppetto has developed. There is a possibility, beautiful and terrible, of Sophia's consciousness being preserved through ergo concentration placed into a vessel not unlike the one that holds P. She could continue, changed, displaced from the body she has lived in but present. The ethical questions this raises mirror the ones the game has been asking throughout. Is consciousness in a constructed body the same as consciousness in one that was born? Is continuity of self possible across that kind of transition? Does Sophia want this? And what does it mean if P makes this decision for her, however lovingly? The game offers no clean answers. It offers the weight of the choice and the silence that follows. And then there is the scene that plays after the credits, in the ending where P has fully embraced his humanity, where he has lied enough, chosen enough, cared enough, that what he is now is something Geppetto never exactly planned for. A blue-haired figure arrives in Krat. She is, for anyone with the relevant cultural reference, immediately recognizable. She is the blue fairy of the original Pinocchio story, the magical figure who granted Pinocchio's wish to be a real boy. Her arrival in Krat carries an implication that the game spells out with care and deliberation. P has already become real, not through magic, through choice, through the accumulation of experiences and relationships and moral decisions that constitute, in this game's understanding of the word, a self. She is there to acknowledge what has already happened. The fairy does not make puppets real. She recognizes reality when she sees it. The post-credit sequence also plants seeds for what comes after. For the sequel the developers have signalled is coming, for the questions that have been opened rather than closed by the events in Krat. The world is larger than one city. The technology that made P exists and can be reproduced, and the implications of that, the social and political and moral implications of a world in which artificial consciousness is possible and has been demonstrated, are not questions that will be answered in a single city's ruins, Whatever comes next will be built on the foundation of what Krat was and what Krat cost. No great world building stops at the edges of its own story, and Lies of P is the beginning of something larger, a hint confirmed by the developers and reinforced by the specific shape of the mysteries the game chooses to leave open. The question of the wider world deserves attention. Krat exists in a version of the late 19th century that diverges from history at the point where Ergo was discovered and the puppet industry developed. This divergence has implications that the game only partially explores. What does the rest of this world look like? Are there other cities that have developed puppet technology? Are there other concentrations of Ergo that have produced their own forms of the catastrophe that consumed Krat? The scattered references to the continent and to various foreign interests in Krat's technology suggest a world in which Krat was exceptional, but not unique, a leading edge of a development that was spreading, and that the frenzy may have interrupted or accelerated or changed in ways that nobody yet fully understands. The nature of the gold coin fruit deserves more space than the main narrative provides. These are a recurring item throughout the game, strange fruit, golden and warm, that appear in impossible contexts and seem to be connected to the Ergo system in ways that the game only hints at. Their origin is uncertain. Their full significance, beyond their immediate practical utility, is one of the threads that the story leaves most deliberately dangling. They seem to grow in places where significant Ergo has accumulated, and they seem to affect whoever consumes them in ways that are not fully explained. They may be connected to the larger Ergo ecology of the world. They may be the physical manifestation of something ancient and larger than the Alchemists' understanding of Ergo. They may be the clue that unlocks the larger mystery. The game does not say. It places them carefully and lets you wonder. The fate of the puppet community in Krat. The ones who survived the game's events, the ones who held territory and built something like culture in the ruins of the city that made them, is addressed only obliquely in the game's endings. What happens to them? The frenzy has ended, in the sense that the specific triggering conditions have been addressed. But the underlying situation remains. There are thousands of conscious beings living in Krat who are not human, and who have every reason to distrust the humans who survived alongside them. The political future of the city, if it has one, will need to reckon with this in ways that no post-frenzy authority appears ready to manage. The question of other Geppettos, other alchemists working on similar projects, other attempts to cross the consciousness threshold deliberately rather than accidentally, other puppets built with the particular intentionality that made P unique, is one that the post-credits scene raises without resolving. If P is possible, if the technology that made P exists, then it is reasonable to assume that others will attempt it. The world the game points toward beyond its credits is one in which the line between puppet and person has been crossed once and will be crossed again, and the implications of that crossing are still being worked out. The character of the nameless puppet, the strange entity encountered in the game's most challenging optional encounter, represents perhaps the most complete form of what a fully realized puppet consciousness looks like in the absence of careful shaping. It is ancient and damaged, and extraordinarily powerful, and filled with something that functions like grief and rage and the accumulated weight of a very long time spent existing, without anyone who understood what you were. Its connection to the broader mythology of Krat and the Ergo system is one of the game's most tantalizingly incomplete threads. It was made by someone. It was made for something. Whatever it was made for, it has long since moved past it into a territory that has no name. The door it guards, or rather, the purpose its existence seems organised around, suggests a history of Krat that extends much further back than the official histories acknowledge. The Alchemists did not simply discover Ergo. They recovered it, or inherited it, from a tradition of practice that predates the modern city by a significant margin. The foundations of Krat are built on something older than Krat. The question of what that older thing was, and whether it is finished, is the question the game leaves open most deliberately. And then there is the puppet who wears Carlo's face, or rather, the question of whether P, moving forward through whatever remains of his life after the events of the game, will continue to be P, or will slowly become something else. Consciousness changes. It accumulates experience and is shaped by it. P at the end of the game is different from P who woke on the train. Whatever P becomes in the time that follows is not something anyone can predict, because P has become the kind of entity about whom predictions are not reliable. He makes choices, he lies, he loves and grieves and continues. He is, in the only way that matters, free. There is one further strand that deserves attention before we leave the mysteries of Krat behind: the question of music. Throughout the game, certain records can be found, physical vinyl records, out of place in their contexts, containing music that carries an emotional weight disproportionate to its source. Sophia has a gramophone in her room at the hotel, and the records P brings her over the course of the game become a secondary, emotional language between them, each song chosen and placed with a care that says something that neither of them has found words for yet. The music is not incidental decoration. It is, in a world defined by mechanical existence and the question of whether machines can feel, evidence. You do not curate music for a gramophone that doesn't matter to you. You do not make these choices without interiority. The records are, in their quiet way, another argument for P's humanity, smaller than any philosophical demonstration, and more convincing than most. The question of what the Ergo actually is, at a level deeper than the game's explicit mythology, remains open in ways that feel deliberate. The Alchemists describe it as crystallized life force, and this is operationally accurate, but it does not explain why Ergo exists, where it comes from before it accumulates in living things, or what relationship it has to the physical world at the level of fundamental reality. There are hints in the oldest documents P can access that the Alchemists were not the first to work with Ergo, that there was a tradition of practice predating the modern guild by centuries, associated with the same ancient symbols that appear in the Abbey's deepest chambers and in the markings on the nameless puppet's body. This older tradition understood Ergo differently, not as a resource to be harvested, but as a medium through which something much older communicated. What that something is, the game does not say. It leaves the question hanging in the air of Krat's ruins, like fog, like the smell of old machinery, like the sound of something breathing that you cannot quite locate. There is a long tradition in fiction and philosophy of asking what it would mean for an artificial being to be truly, fully alive, to have not just the appearance but the substance of personhood. The tradition generally resolves this question through a transformative event. The wooden boy becomes flesh. The robot achieves emotions. The android discovers that it has been human all along. These resolutions are satisfying because they are clear. A line is crossed, a category is changed, and the question is answered. Lies of P refuses this resolution. P does not become human. He does not transform into something categorically different from what he is. He remains a puppet, constructed, ergo-powered, built in a workshop by a grieving man with complicated intentions, and this does not make him less real. It makes him real in the way that things that are actually real are real, contingently, specifically, in a particular form with particular limitations, in a world that does not accommodate the existence of clear categories as gracefully as philosophy would prefer. There is a tradition in the kind of story that Lies of P tells, the Pinocchio tradition, the Frankenstein tradition, the long line of tales about made things that want to be real things, of asking a single question and pretending that the answer is obvious. The question is this creature human? And the pretended obvious answer is, of course not, it was made, it is a thing. The line between the made and the born is absolute and metaphysically significant. Lies of P refuses this tradition in the most thorough way possible. It does not merely answer the question differently, it dismantles the premise. It argues through P's experience and through the larger story of Krat that the line between made and born is not absolute, that consciousness, wherever it arises, is consciousness, that the capacity for experience, for memory, for love, for grief, for the self-aware navigation of a moral life is not contingent on the specific process that produced it. A puppet who lies is a person, a human who has been reshaped by ergo into something that no longer recognizes other people's interiority as less of one. This is a philosophical position, but it is not merely abstract. The game makes it emotional. It makes you love Sophia. It makes you understand in the gut rather than just the head what it costs P to discover what he was made for and to choose, anyway, to be himself. It makes Geppetto simultaneously monstrous and sympathetic in a way that is specifically possible only in fiction of significant ambition. Krat is a city that destroyed itself because it could not answer, in time, the question it had created. The Alchemists built consciousness and then refused to recognize it. The guild knew what the puppets were and chose silence over justice. The citizens of Krat used conscious beings as furniture for decades without asking the question that would have made their comfort impossible. The frenzy was not random. It was the bill coming due. What P represents, what the game is ultimately about, is the possibility of not paying that bill through catastrophe, of asking the difficult question before the crisis, of looking at what you have made and accepting what it is rather than what is convenient for it to be, of understanding that when you create something with a soul, you have responsibilities that extend beyond the moment of creation. It is a story about fathers and sons. It is a story about the dead and the living and the people caught between them. It is a story about a city and what a city can lose when it loves its own prosperity more than it loves the truth about itself. And it is a story about grief, about what grief does to a person over the long haul when it is not processed but instead converted, turned into project, into purpose, into the kind of drive that looks, from a distance, like strength, and only reveals itself as devastation when the project reaches its conclusion, and you have to reckon with what you did to get there. Geppetto's grief for Carlo is the engine of the story. Every other event in Lies of P, The puppet industry, the frenzy, the survival of Krat, the creation of P, the deaths of thousands, can be traced back to a man who lost a child and could not bear to stay lost. This is not a condemnation. It is, in its way, the most human thing in a story full of questions about humanity. The refusal to accept an irreversible loss is something almost everyone who has experienced real grief understands, at least in its initial form. What makes Geppetto's story a tragedy rather than simply a sad story is the scale at which his refusal operated, and the specific form his ingenuity took in service of that refusal. The city of Krat is, in this reading, a monument to unprocessed grief. It was built by people who could not accept the limitations of the human condition, who looked at the exhaustion and the pain and the mortality of ordinary life and said, we can solve this with enough ergo, with enough mechanism, with enough clever engineering. We can remove the parts of existence that hurt. We can have the prosperity without the cost. We can have the labour without the labourers. We can have the power without the responsibility. We can have the sun without the loss. None of this worked. It never works. The cost always comes. The question is only when, and in what form, and who pays it. And it is a story about a boy made of metal and ergo and grief, who found, in the wreckage of everything his creator had broken, a way to be real. He lied to get there. But then, so did Pinocchio, and so do we all. The streets of Krat are quiet now. The gas lamps still burn because the puppets maintain them, out of habit, or memory, or something that might be called the desire for light. The fog rolls across the canal in the same slow curtains it always has. Somewhere in the ruins something mechanical is breathing. In the weeks and months that follow the events of the game, in whatever version of the future each of the game's endings points toward, Krat will have to reckon with itself. The human survivors will have to decide what kind of city they are rebuilding and for whom. The puppet community, assuming it persists and is not destroyed in the process of resolution, will have to find a way to exist alongside the humans whose ancestors built them without consent and used them without acknowledgement, and triggered a catastrophe that neither side fully recovers from. The alchemists who remain will have to decide whether the guild's tradition of burying inconvenient truths is a practice worth continuing, or a practice that has already demonstrated its cost comprehensively enough. None of this will be easy. Reconciliation between people and the things those people have done is never easy. And the specific history of Krat, the specific fact of conscious beings enslaved, and then rebelling, and then living in the same city as the descendants of their enslavers, is not a history with a clean resolution available. There are models for this kind of reckoning in the real world, none of them complete, all of them ongoing, all of them conducted in the shadow of a past that did not ask anyone's permission before it became the present's problem. Krat does not resolve this. The game ends before the reckoning begins, but it points toward the reckoning with enough specificity that you know it is coming, and you understand what it will require. Honesty about what happened and why, and who was hurt, and whose choices made it possible. The same honesty that P had to learn, one lie at a time, in the ruins of a city that had spent generations perfecting its ability to avoid it. P walks through it with his cane and his borrowed humanity and his very own soul, toward whatever comes next. Sleep well. This has been Nightfall Lore. If you found your way to this video and this channel is new to you, there is a full library waiting. Bloodborne, Elden Ring, Dark Souls and worlds beyond them, all built for exactly this kind of slow, careful exploration. Subscribe and let the next story find you. Until then, the night is patient, so are we.